Welcome back, you night owls. So tonight we step into the scorching sands and suffocating reality of ancient Egypt. But not as a pharaoh, not as a glorious general, and certainly not as a tomb-raiding archaeologist. Tonight, you're a wetty W, one of the low-ranking embalmer's assistants, a specialist in the deeply unpleasant and often very smelly business of making a mummy. You've just landed the worst job in the whole kingdom, a role that mixes sacred ritual with sheer, gross labour, all under the relentless, dehydrating glare of the Egyptian sun. You trudge through the dry dust, your leather sandals slapping against the cracked earth, toward the place of purification, or Ibu, a simple, temporary shelter near the edge of the desert, safely away from the main town, because frankly your work smells terrible. It's a humid, oppressively hot morning, the kind where the air already feels thick and heavy with the promise of a 120 degrees Fahrenheit day. The only thing you look forward to is the meagre shade of the tent where the body lies, wrapped tightly in a shroud, waiting. The air is still, but the scent that hits you is anything but. A sickly sweet, coppery odour, already mingling with the medicinal sour tang of spices and the underlying filth of a busy workshop. This is your life now. Sweat, sand, and the smell of death that you will never truly wash off. Your clothes, your hands, your very breath, they will carry this scent forever. You probably won't survive this apprenticeship without a few serious infections, given the constant exposure to bodily fluids and the general lack of hygiene. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand before the high priest, the Wab priest, who smells pleasantly of expensive cedar oil and wears pristine white linen. He, of course, will do none of the actual dirty work. He's there for the incantations, the prayers, and the oversight. You, the humble assistant, are there for the gore. Your current client is a wealthy merchant, someone important enough for the full, lavish 70-day treatment, which means you have to get this right. The priest nods, and you know the moment has come. This first critical step is not performed by you, thankfully, but by a specialised, marginalised worker known as the scribe, or the slitter. His job is quick, brutal, and essential. You watch, stomach tightening, as he approaches the deceased's flank just below the rib cage. He wields a specialised stone knife, likely a blade of Ethiopian flint. In this era, stone tools were often reserved for ritualistic use, especially when metal was considered impure or too modern for touching the sacred process of preparing for eternity. He makes a long, precise incision down the left side of the torso. It must be deep enough to allow access for the coming evisceration, but not so deep as to mar the appearance more than necessary. The cut itself is less than a minute of work, but the aftermath is immediate. Now here is your first taste of your new reality. The moment the cut is made, the scribe is expected to drop his flint knife and immediately flee. Historically, the other embalmers, who are about to begin their work, would actually pelt him with stones and hurl insults at him. It's a classic quirky tidbit of ancient ritual. The necessity of the cut is acknowledged, as the organs must be removed for preservation, but the act of injuring the body is simultaneously condemned. The body must be whole to enter the afterlife, and even though this cut is required to achieve that, the man who performed it is momentarily considered unclean and must be ritually chased away. You're too low-ranking to throw a stone, but you certainly shout a tired, half-hearted insult at the back of his retreating head as he runs off into the glare. The slitter is gone, and the actual hard labour begins with you. You and another assistant must carefully turn the body onto its stomach to allow any remaining fluids to drain out of that new incision. This is where the sensory overload truly begins. The smell intensifies, and you start fighting the flies, the eternal buzzing curse of the embalmer. You're immediately sticky with sweat and whatever fluids are draining, and the desert heat is your enemy, accelerating the decay you're supposed to be stopping. Mainstream historical fact time. The entire 70-day period for mummification was based not on a random number, but on the time it took for the star Sopdet, Sirius, to become visible again in the night sky. The reappearance of Sopdet heralded the annual flooding of the Nile, linking the renewal of the cosmos and the agricultural year to the spiritual rebirth of the deceased. The 70-day cycle wasn't just a deadline, it was a cosmic alignment. You, the assistant, feel none of that cosmic magic. You just know that 70 days is a very long time to spend around a drying corpse in a heatwave. You now have a long, tedious and immensely unpleasant task, cleaning and rinsing the now open body cavity. You must use a solution of palm wine and ground up spices. The alcohol in the palm wine acts as a disinfectant and helps sterilize the wound, and the spices, like cassia and myrrh, help combat the overwhelming smell. You plunge your hands, already stained a deep reddish brown from previous work, into the body. This is a job that requires you to be part butcher, part ritual purifier. You are scraping, cleaning and rinsing the chest and abdominal cavities, reaching deep inside to make sure no tissue or residual liquid is left behind. Every swipe of your hand across the ribs feels like scraping hot, wet leather. You keep your head down and focus on the sheer mechanics of the task, because if you let your mind wander, you'll start thinking about the man whose body you're violating, the merchant who probably had a nice family and a cool boat. You focus instead on the practicalities, how much palm wine you have left, how your back is starting to ache from bending over in the heat, and how you're definitely going to need to bathe in the Nile tonight, despite knowing exactly how filthy that water is. You're constantly aware of the presence of the priest. He's not watching your every move, but he is certainly watching your attitude. Your role, though dirty, is still a necessary component of the religious ritual. Any show of disrespect, any sigh of complaint or any obvious sign of disgust could mean a beating or worse. You're expected to be reverent, or at least pretend to be, while elbow deep in biological waste. You find yourself wondering about the materials. The quality of the final mummy depends entirely on the wealth of the family, and that translates directly into the materials you get to work with. For this merchant, you'll get good, expensive natron salt for drying and high-grade resin for sealing. For a poor farmer, you might be scraping by with sawdust and poor-quality bitumen, resulting in a much less durable mummy, but that's a problem for Section 3. Right now, your entire focus is on the interior cleanup. You even have to consider the risk of foreign objects. Occasionally a relative will sneak in a small amulet or a piece of jewellery after the initial embalming stage, hoping it will be missed, which you are supposed to report as theft, but you sometimes pocket a tiny, worthless piece yourself just to make the day feel less miserable. The sheer difficulty of keeping this area sanitary in the desert heat is another constant nagging concern. Every surface, every tool, must be meticulously wiped clean with the palm wine solution, and every cloth you use is tossed onto a growing fly-covered heap that will have to be burned later. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians truly understood the microbial basis of infection, or if their use of resin, linen and natron was purely empirical. They just knew what worked to preserve a body, even if their explanation involved gods and magic rather than bacteria and dehydration. Whatever the reason, the methods are effective, but your working conditions are brutal. You feel a sharp cramp in your shoulder and take a deep breath, trying to draw in the clean, dry air but only succeeding in pulling in more of the sickly, sweet, putrefying odour. The first step, the cleanup, is almost complete. Your hands are scraped raw, your back is aching, and you haven't even touched the most disgusting yet necessary part of the job yet, the brain. The sun is climbing higher now, baking the desert floor and turning your little purification tent into a genuine oven. You've finished the initial messy internal wash of the torso, and now you must move on to the head, a task that gives even the most seasoned wetty a little tremor of dread. You approach the deceased, lying now on a clean, if slightly stained slab of stone. You try to think of this as just a vessel, an empty shell, but the familiarity of the face, the heavy-lidded eyes, the set of the jaw, makes the violation feel profoundly personal. The brain, unlike the heart, was generally not considered an important seat of intelligence or emotion by the ancient Egyptians. It was largely viewed as unnecessary organic matter, essentially just stuffing, that would rapidly decay and compromise the integrity of the whole body if left inside. It had to go. And this is where you encounter the most rudimentary yet somehow most horrifying piece of equipment in your embalmer's kit. The brain hook. It's a long, slender instrument, perhaps a bit longer than your forearm, usually made of bronze with a delicate sharpened curve or hook at the end. You hold it in your hand, its cool metal a momentary comfort against your sweaty palm, and you know what you must do. The standard procedure for the elite mummification you are performing, the first-class package, so to speak, involves extraction through the nose. You carefully tilt the head back, bringing the nostrils into view. The first step is to forcefully insert a sharp chisel or a thin rod into the nasal cavity, and essentially break through the thin, delicate bone of the ethmoid plate, the barrier separating the nasal passage from the cranial vault. You have to strike the rod with a small wooden mallet, a muffled, sickening thunk that makes the priest standing nearby flinch slightly. You try to be gentle, but this is a procedure requiring focused force, and the sound is always jarring. You whisper a quick, necessary incantation, something about opening the path to the stars, more for the benefit of the priest than for any genuine belief in its efficacy, just to cover the reality of what you're doing. Once the bone is breached, the truly disgusting work begins. You insert the long, thin brain hook up into the nostril, angling it upward and backward, deep into the cranial space. The technique is to gently, methodically churn or scramble the brain tissue. It must be liquefied into a slurry so it can be drained out, as there's no easy way to pull out the whole intact organ. It's a slow, meticulous and completely gross process. You are essentially mushing a vital organ from the inside, working blind, guided only by the feel of the resistance and the slow, thin trickle of fluid back down the nasal passage. The texture you feel through the hook is not the stuff of medical textbooks, but a thick, slippery consistency that makes your skin crawl. You rotate the hook, pull it back a few inches, reinsert it deeper, then swirl it again. You repeat this until the resistance gives way to a kind of soup. This is a crucial point, because if you don't break up all the tissue, the remaining matter will rot, turning the head into a grotesque liquefying mess and ruining the entire 70-day process, which would certainly result in a severe reprimand for you. You pause, sweat dripping from your brow. The intense heat makes everything flow faster. You then turn the head back to its side, hoping gravity will do its job, and watch as a gruesome grey-reddish discharge, mixed with bloody mucus, begins to slowly drain out of the nostril and into the small bronze bowl you've placed underneath. This drainage can take hours, even a full day, requiring you to constantly nudge and coax the flow with the hook. You use long strips of linen dipped in water to wipe the mucus from the man's upper lip, a gesture that feels perversely tender considering the internal chaos you just created. This constant close proximity to the bodily fluids is a breeding ground for infection, and your colleagues often suffer from persistent coughs, eye infections, and the occasional life-threatening fever. You're constantly thinking about the cost of the operation. This elite method, the nasal extraction, is the preferred clean-looking way for the wealthy. Historians still argue whether the alternative, cruder method, smashing the brain out through a hole bored through the eye socket, was truly a standard practice, or only used for the very poorest mummies, where speed and low cost were the main objectives rather than a neat finish. Either way, you're grateful you don't have to deal with the inevitable facial damage that would entail, even if the nasal method is a true test of your stomach. You stand back for a moment, letting the head continue to drain, using the brief respite to rub your aching shoulders. You catch the eye of your junior apprentice, a nervous boy who looks like he's about to throw up from the smell, which is an impressive feat considering he was born into this world of death and embalming. You give him a gentle wetty smirk, a blend of sympathy and "you're going to suffer too, kid," and toss him a piece of dark day-old bread. This is just one of the 3 light jokes you manage to find in your miserable day. If you want to keep your lunch down, don't look up his nose, you mumble to the boy, who manages a weak giggle. After the initial drainage, you'll need to rinse the cranial cavity as well. You use more of that precious strong palm wine, perhaps even a splash of some fragrant juniper oil, pouring it carefully into one nostril and letting it trickle back out, flushing away any remaining fragments. This whole process is the epitome of the embalmer's art, combining brutal physical labour with chemical knowledge and religious ritual. Mainstream historical fact: the Egyptians were so adept at preservation that traces of the original brain matter, remarkably well preserved, have been found in the skulls of mummies where the embalmers had failed to completely extract it, showing that despite their skill, the process was not always 100% successful. As you finish the rinsing, you must carefully fill the now empty skull. For this high-status client, you'll be using strips of fine linen soaked in molten resin, often cedar resin, to fill the space and ensure the skull holds its shape. You might even use some precious myrrh as a filler, which helps with the aroma and provides a powerful, pleasant scent to counteract the lingering smell of decomposition. You have to push the saturated linen deep into the cavity with a wooden spatula, gently pressing it down. This is the last intimate contact you will have with the brain's former home, securing the head for its 70-day journey. You are constantly battling the heat and the need for speed. The sun is at its zenith, and the temperature inside the tent feels like a furnace. The risk of the delicate work being compromised by accelerated decay is very real. You think about the irony. You're working to ensure a wealthy man's eternal life while you yourself are probably shaving years off your own life through exposure to disease and toxic chemicals. You're covered in a thin, greasy film of sweat, oil, and the man's residue, and the tiny sand particles blowing in from the desert cling to everything. A quirky tidbit for you. A common complaint among embalmers of your low rank was the sheer amount of sand they ate during the day, which grit their teeth down over years of work, leading to constant dental problems. One more regret for your miserable career. Finally, the head is sealed. The resin is cooling, the linen is packed tight, and the nose is clean, looking remarkably intact despite the violence done internally. You wipe the face one last time, a strange mix of respect and exhaustion settling over you. You gather the bowl of discarded brain matter and take it outside to be ritually disposed of, perhaps buried in the sand or even mixed with the offal that will be fed to sacred animals. You turn to the torso, now ready for the next, even more organ-intensive step, the full evisceration. With the gruesome task of brain removal behind you, your attention snaps back to the main cavity of the wealthy merchant's body. The side incision, made by the slitter in the previous step, is now fully exposed, a large dark opening on the flank of the torso. This is the moment for the evisceration, the most chemically critical part of the entire process, second only to the drying phase. If you fail to remove all the moisture-rich internal organs now, the body will putrefy from the inside out, no matter how much natron you apply later. You and your fellow Wetiablu assistants don a pair of thick leather aprons, less for modesty and more for the meagre protection they offer against the biological hazards and staining oils. The scent in the tent, already a potent mix of decaying matter and sharp palm wine, now seems to thicken with the copper tang of fresh blood and bile. You pick up the tools of the trade, a set of sharp obsidian knives for cutting away tissue, and perhaps a flat curved wooden spatula for scraping. The organs must be carefully removed one by one, a methodical process guided by both practicality and deep-seated religious belief. You start with the most accessible organs, pulling them out and carefully identifying each one. The intestines are the worst part, a massive coiled mass that contains an incredible amount of putrefying material. You have to handle them with immense care, as a rupture would unleash a fresh wave of infection and odour you simply don't have the time to clean up completely in this heat. You manage a nervous chuckle, the second of your 3 light jokes for the day. If a wealthy man's gut is this full, imagine how much he ate at the last festival. We should charge extra for the extra length. As you remove each organ, the lungs, the stomach, the liver and the intestines, they are immediately passed to another assistant who must carefully rinse them in palm wine, just as you did with the body cavity. This swift cleaning is essential to remove any residual digestive material. It's a race against the clock and the Egyptian environment. The desert air, with its abundance of dust and opportunistic insects, is constantly trying to undermine your efforts. If you leave the organs exposed for too long, even for a few minutes, flies will lay eggs, and the whole batch might be compromised. Mainstream historical fact. Of all the major organs, the heart was the one critical exception to the removal process. The Egyptians believed the heart, IB, was the seat of the soul, intelligence, emotion, and memory. It was essential that the heart remain in the body to be weighed against the feather of Mayat truth and justice in the Hall of Two Truths in the afterlife. You are explicitly warned, under pain of severe punishment, never to nick, damage, or accidentally remove the heart. You meticulously work around the chest cavity, leaving the intact heart resting in its place, a small, dark, vital exception in the now empty torso. The extracted organs are not merely discarded, they are given a preservation treatment almost as extensive as the body itself. They are individually packed with natron and spices, thoroughly dried, and then ritually wrapped in fine linen. Now comes the crucial step involving the canopic jars. You, or a senior assistant, carefully place the organs into 4 designated sacred vessels. These are the canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus, protecting a specific organ. Imseti, human head, protects the liver. Hapi, baboon head, protects the lungs. Duamutef, jackal head, protects the stomach. Kebesenuef, falcon head, protects the intestines. As you place the organs, the supervising priest recites the necessary incantations, invoking the protection of the appropriate son of Horus for that specific jar. You are struck, not for the first time, by the strange duality of your job, performing this messy, stomach-churning labour while listening to the beautiful sacred words promising eternity. The jars themselves are often made of alabaster, or painted ceramic for a wealthy client like yours, and they will be placed in the tomb alongside the mummy. They represent a fundamental belief that the deceased needed all their parts, even when separated, to be complete for the journey into the field of reeds. Once the cavity is entirely empty, you begin the secondary cleaning process. The inside of the body must be scrubbed again, first with more palm wine, and then with a paste of crushed aromatic resins and spices, like myrrh, cassia, and perhaps even some juniper berries. This paste serves a dual purpose. It acts as a primitive embalming agent and helps mask the pervasive odour. You have to reach in and physically coat the entire internal surface, a task that leaves your arms coated in sticky, fragrant goo. You think about the poor labourers in the spice markets who had to grind these precious materials down. A quirky tidbit is that, historically, the price of myrrh was often greater than the price of silver, yet you are splashing it around inside a dead man like it's cheap floor cleaner. Now comes the crucial moment to prepare the body for the main 40-day drying process. The massive cavity you created through the flank incision must be stuffed to help the body hold its shape and absorb residual moisture. You're not filling it with the final permanent materials yet, but temporary stuffing. You use pouches of linen filled with natron salt, sawdust, and perhaps some dry aromatic herbs. You pack the cavity tight, moulding the body back into a respectable, lifelike appearance. You want the merchant to look dignified when the family next sees him, not like a shrunken husk. Historians still argue whether the internal organs were routinely reinserted into the body cavity after the drying process, or if they were always placed exclusively in the canopic jars. Evidence suggests that in some periods the organs, sometimes wrapped together in a single package, were placed back inside the torso, with the canopic jars becoming purely symbolic or empty ceremonial containers. This constant shift in method means you can never be entirely sure which procedure the priest will demand until you start, adding another layer of stress to your job. The greatest danger right now is the possibility of putrefaction setting in before the body is fully packed in natron. The humidity, even in the dry desert climate, can be surprisingly high near the Nile, and the bacterial load is enormous. If you see signs of slippage, a green tinge, a particularly strong foul odour that cuts through the palm wine, you have to panic pack the body faster and immediately move it to the drying pit. You look at the body, now ready, lying there, a hollowed out vessel, but one now ritually purified. You feel a brief surge of tired pride. You have stopped the decay for now. You and your partner carefully lift the body. The heat makes this heavy, slippery task incredibly difficult. You have to navigate the tent, stepping over jars and pools of liquid, carrying the merchant outside and toward the natron pit. You stumble slightly, the third of your 3 light jokes slipping out. Careful, friend. If we drop him, we have to start the 70 days all over again, which earns a tired elbow from your colleague. As you step out of the relative shade of the tent, the full, blinding sun hits you. The sand is scorching beneath your sandals. Ahead of you is the purpose-dug pit, a simple, shallow trench in the dry sand, lined perhaps with a reed mat, and now filled with thousands of pounds of precious, moisture-sucking natron salt, waiting like a massive chalky coffin. You trudge across the blistering sand, carrying the heavy, now hollowed-out body of the wealthy merchant. The heat radiating from the ground is intense, scorching the soles of your feet even through your thick leather sandals. Finally, you reach the drying area, an expanse dedicated to the long, passive yet absolutely critical stage of mummification. Dehydration by natron salt. Before you lies the natron pit. It's not a deep hole, but a carefully prepared, brick-lined or simply packed earth basin, situated far enough away from the Nile's humidity to ensure maximum dryness. This pit is filled with massive quantities of natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture, chemically a combination of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, with traces of sodium chloride and sodium sulfate. This substance, mined primarily from the Wadi Natron in the Western Desert, is the true star of the show. It is a powerful desiccant, capable of drawing out nearly all the water from the body's tissues, stopping bacterial growth dead in its tracks. You and your assistant gently place the body down onto a thick layer of natron already spread on the bottom of the pit. The salt is cool and dry to the touch, and you see the fine white powder immediately begin to cling to the body's still damp surfaces. You then begin the meticulous process of burying the merchant. You must carefully pack the natron everywhere. Every crease, every fold of skin, every available space must be filled and covered completely. You use small wooden scoops in your own hands, pushing the salt into the armpits, between the fingers and behind the ears. The goal is total immersion. When you're finished, the merchant's body will be completely invisible, entombed beneath a solid crystalline mass of natron, like a giant chalky cocoon. This stage lasts for the better part of 40 days, the absolute majority of the 70-day mummification period. You will spend those 6 weeks and change in a state of nervous, nose-wrinkling dread. The job now shifts from physically gruesome to mentally agonizing. Your principal role during these 40 days is supervision and maintenance. You are the custodian of the salt pit, which sounds simple until you consider the reality of the Egyptian environment. Your first priority is monitoring the salt itself. As it pulls water out of the body, the natron closest to the corpse becomes saturated and less effective. You have to periodically dig down, carefully scoop out the damp, discoloured salt, and replace it with fresh, dry natron. This is a delicate process, as disturbing the body too much could break the skin or shift the temporary stuffing, compromising the final appearance. You quickly learn to identify the telltale signs of saturation: a slight clumping, a change in colour to a sort of greyish-pink slurry, and an immediate sharp increase in the smell. While the natron is highly effective at stopping decay, the initial process of drawing out the bodily fluids means the area is still deeply unpleasant. You are essentially supervising the world's longest, slowest stew of salt and human fluid. Your third and final 3 light jokes for this section slips out as you hand your assistant a fresh scoop. The priests say this is the journey to the stars, but to me, it smells like a camel died in a salt lick. Mainstream historical fact: the exact duration of the process, the full 70 days, was of profound religious significance, mirroring the legendary time the god Osiris spent, concealed by his jealous brother Seth before being resurrected. The 40 days spent in natron was the symbolic equivalent of his period of suffering and dehydration, preparing him for rebirth, while the remaining 30 days were dedicated to wrapping, anointing, and final rituals. You, however, just see 40 days of blistering heat and salt-cracked hands. Another immense challenge during this drying phase is the omnipresent problem of pests. The salt may deter bacteria, but it does not deter every creature looking for a meal or a moist place to lay eggs. You are constantly on the lookout for scavenging animals, dogs, jackals, or even rodents, who might attempt to dig through the salt to reach the body beneath. You place nets and heavy stones around the edges of the pit, but the effort is unending. Furthermore, insects are a nightmare. Tiny flies, determined to find a crevice, will lay eggs in any exposed area, and if larvae hatch during the drying process, they will quickly consume the desiccating tissue, ruining the body. You spend your days patrolling the edges, swatting, shooing, and praying that no beetles manage to breach your defences. The physical toll of this job is enormous. The natron itself is extremely abrasive and drying. Your hands are cracked and sore, constantly suffering from small, painful cuts. The fine powder gets everywhere, in your eyes, coating your throat and clinging to your sweaty skin. It's a miracle you don't suffer from constant severe respiratory issues, though your chronic cough suggests otherwise. You have to drink immense amounts of water to counteract the dehydrating effects of the environment, and of course that water is often drawn straight from the heavily polluted Nile. You sit for hours, watching the mound of salt squinting in the merciless sunlight. The boredom is immense, punctuated only by the necessary maintenance and the occasional visit from the high priest to ensure the process is proceeding according to the strict ritualistic schedule. This forced inactivity gives you too much time to think about your marginalised place in society. Historians still argue whether the natron was actually used in its dry, powdered form as you're using it now, or if it was sometimes used in a concentrated solution where the body was essentially soaked in a brine. Most evidence points to the dry packing method, as it allows the salt to directly draw moisture out through osmosis without the risk of water reintroduction. but you often hear whispers from the senior wetiabu about older methods that involved soaking the dead in salty, odoriferous baths. A quirky tidbit about the materials. Because natron was a royal monopoly, its high cost often forced the poor to adopt much simpler, cheaper forms of preservation. Instead of the 40-day salt bath, poor mummies might simply be interred in the naturally desiccating hot desert sand. Or, in a less dignified practice, they might be simply soaked in heated bitumen, a natural tar, which sealed and preserved the body quickly, though often turning it into a black, brittle and shapeless mass. You're acutely aware that the wealth of your client translates directly into the quality of your working materials and the ultimate success of the mummification. You're grateful for the abundance of pure natron, even if it is currently drying your skin out like old parchment. As the weeks drag on, you begin to observe the subtle but profound transformation of the body beneath the salt. The volume decreases noticeably. The skin, having lost most of its water, shrinks and toughens, becoming like dry leather. When you periodically examine a corner of the body by carefully brushing away a small patch of natron, you feel the difference. The tissues are firm, no longer yielding under pressure. This is the moment of triumph. The natural process of decay has been arrested not by magic, but by chemistry. 40 days of scorching heat, constant vigilance and salt-cracked misery have paid off. The merchant is now a dried husk, a vessel ready for the next phase of transformation. On the 40th day, the high priest and a retinue arrive for the removal ceremony. You and your partner carefully lift the body out of the pit, shaking off the crust of natron. The salt is saved and recycled for future less wealthy clients. The body is now incredibly light, almost weightless, and its shrunken, desiccated appearance is a stark contrast to the plump form you started with. You must now carefully wash the natron residue off the body with water and a linen cloth before moving to the next stage of purification and anointing. The smell is still there, but it is now a dry, earthy, dusty smell, overlaid with the sharp scent of the salt. The smell of successful preservation, which is to you the smell of job security. You've successfully pulled the merchant's shrunken form from the natron pit, and now you're scrubbing the salt residue from his brittle, leathery skin. The next few weeks, the final 30 days of the process, are spent back inside the main workshop, a somewhat larger, but no less hot or dusty, structure adjacent to the ibu. This is the period of anointing, stuffing and wrapping, and it brings you into even closer, more sustained contact with the filth and hierarchy of your profession. The first immediate problem is your own person and the environment. You're working in close proximity to decomposing matter, bodily fluids, and various organic materials like resins, spices and old linen. This environment is an absolute magnet for pests and a petri dish for disease. You're constantly scratching. Lice and fleas are an inescapable reality of life for a lower caste wetiw. Despite your attempts to wash in the Nile, the lack of effective soap and the shared working and living spaces mean you are constantly infested. You see your colleagues frequently shaving their heads and bodies, not out of spiritual belief like the priests, but as a desperate measure to control the biting, itching vermin. Beyond the creepy crawlies, the greater threat is disease. You are habitually exposed to pathogens. Fevers are common, a relentless burning reality that incapacitates your peers. Infections are a massive risk. A simple cut or scrape, inevitable from working with sharp tools or abrasive natron, can quickly turn into a festering, life-threatening wound exacerbated by the constant contact with unhygienic substances. You frequently apply poultices made of dubious ingredients, hoping to ward off the curse of the open wound, as you grimly call it. You even use things like stale bread mixed with mould, a quirky tidbit of ancient medicine that, surprisingly, has a basis in fungal antibiotics, though you have no idea why it sometimes works. Meanwhile, the workshop itself is constantly under siege from vermin. Mice and rats are a daily battle, lured by the leftover spices and oils, and they pose a significant threat, not just by contaminating your precious materials, but by potentially damaging a finished mummy left unattended. You spend part of every evening setting simple traps or chasing them out with sticks, a futile effort that feels like trying to sweep back the desert. This miserable existence stands in stark contrast to the opulence and hygiene of your supervisor, the high priest or overseer of the mysteries. This priest, often a man of immense learning and high social status, is the public face of the operation. He is impeccably clean, often smelling of expensive cedar oil, and his linen robes are pristine white. He performs the sacred rites, the prayers, and the final sealing of the tomb. He touches the mummy only for the most ritualistic parts, and certainly never performs the messy internal work. Your social position is a source of constant frustration and resentment. You are essential. Without you, there are no mummies, and without mummies, there is no effective afterlife for the elite. Yet you are utterly marginalised. You're considered unclean by many, a necessary evil who deals with death. People often recoil from you in the marketplace. The high priest treats you with a mixture of scorn and pragmatic necessity. You're simply a skilled labourer, replaceable if you get too sick or too uppity. When the priest enters the workshop, often with the deceased's family in tow for an inspection, you must snap to attention. He never addresses you directly by name, usually just with a dismissive wave or a harsh command. He might scold you for not being meticulous enough, or for using too much of a particular expensive resin, which he views as his profit being wasted. You endure the dressing down, knowing that your paycheck, paltry as it is, depends entirely on his good, or at least indifferent graces. You reflect on the hierarchy. There is the priest, then the actual embalmer who directs the chemical process, and then you, the wetty W, the lowest assistant, the one who cleans the organs, scrapes the skin, and takes the brunt of the physical labour and the social stigma. You are expected to be reverent and subservient, even when the priest is clearly eyeing the most expensive myrrh resin for his own personal use, or when he tries to skim a percentage of your meagre rations. Mainstream historical fact. The social stigma attached to the actual manual labourers in mummification was so pronounced that, in some historical accounts from Greek observers like Herodotus, the labourers who performed the physical slicing and organ removal were actively avoided and even ritually chased and stoned after their part was done. While the ritual stoning might have been exaggerated or confined to very specific periods, the profound social exclusion of your job is absolutely real. You live in a professional bubble, interacting mainly with other assistants, and you know you'll never marry outside of your small, tainted community. You try to keep your spirits up by finding a moment of dark amusement. You watch the high priest recoil dramatically from a common housefly that dares to land on his immaculate linen shoulder. It must be hard for him, you mumble under your breath to your assistant who manages a smirk, having to deal with all this death while remaining so spiritually pure. This is your first light joke for this section, a small shared rebellion against the hierarchy. The priest is now inspecting the body, demanding that you apply a thicker coat of aromatic unguent to the legs. You dip your hand into the pot of thick, sticky oil, a mixture of various animal fats and expensive plant extracts, and begin to rub it vigorously into the desiccated skin. This stage, the anointing, is meant to restore some suppleness to the body, making it less fragile for the wrapping process, and to make it smell suitably divine. The scent of the unguent is overpowering, a cloying, musky fragrance that tries its best to mask the underlying scent of natron and dry tissue. The relentless battle against sanitation is not just about health, it's about the eternal reputation of the place of purification. If a mummy leaves your care smelling foul or compromised by insect damage, it reflects poorly on the temple and, crucially, on the high priest. Your job is not just preservation, it's quality control in an unhygienic age. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians utilised basic soaps, which were essentially fat-based cleaning agents mixed with natron, more for personal hygiene or for purely ritual cleansing of tools in the workshop. Regardless, the availability of such cleansing agents is minimal for a low-ranking labourer like you, and you rely mostly on simple water and sand. You look down at your hands, which are perpetually stained a brownish red from the constant handling of oils, resins, and traces of human tissue. They are cracked, dry from the salt, and often itching madly from the vermin. This is the mark of your profession, the indelible sign that you are a worker of the dead. You manage your second light joke as you wipe your hands on your dirty apron. We're the only men in Egypt guaranteed to get all the best spices, even if we only get to wear them, not eat them. You pick up a piece of discarded linen, infested with tiny black dots, flea eggs, and toss it onto the pile for burning. The reality is that the conditions are primitive, the work is hard, and the respect is non-existent. But you are a skilled worker, and in a kingdom obsessed with the afterlife, You are indispensable. You just have to endure the vermin, the illness, and the high priest's continuous withering scorn. You're about to move on to the delicate process of preserving the heart's integrity, a spiritual minefield that could get you executed for a misplaced knife. You're now in the intermediate phase of the mummification, dealing with the desiccated, leather-like body of the merchant. Having endured the initial mess and the 40 days of natron boredom, you move into the spiritual heart of the operation, literally. This section centres on the heart, the one organ that the gods decreed must remain untouched, and the necessary inclusion of the scarab amulet, the final insurance policy for the deceased's journey through the afterlife. You approach the chest cavity, which you'll recall was meticulously scraped clean and left intact around this vital organ. The entire body is now stiff and brittle, so you have to work with extreme caution, gently massaging a restorative unguent into the torso to soften the skin and prevent cracking. You peer into the empty cavity, shining a small bronze mirror to reflect the sunlight and inspect the area where the heart rests. It is a small, dark, dense piece of tissue, having shrunk considerably during the natron bath, but it is there, still attached to the great vessels. It must be protected at all costs. Mainstream historical fact: the preservation of the heart, IB, was non-negotiable because of its central role in the weighing of the heart ceremony in the afterlife, a moment of profound judgment. The deceased would appear before Osiris, and the heart would be placed on a great scale, balanced against the feather of Maat, the goddess of truth and justice. If the heart was heavy with sin, the scale would tip, and the heart would be devoured by the terrifying demon Amit, consigning the soul to a second death. If the heart was light and pure, the deceased would pass into the blissful field of reeds. Your work, therefore, has immediate and eternal consequences. You understand this pressure well. Any damage to the heart, even accidental, is a sacrilege and a professional catastrophe. You use small, rounded wooden tools to work the thick, fragrant resin around the heart, carefully coating the vessels and the surrounding cavity walls without touching the organ itself. You're essentially sealing the organ in place, insulating it within the body's protective shell. The heart is the seat of the man's identity, and you must treat it with utmost reverence despite your low social standing. You even perform a quiet, private prayer, a brief rote memorization you picked up from the priests, just to cover your spiritual bases. Once the heart is secure, your focus shifts to its magical protection. The family has provided a beautifully carved, high-quality heart scarab. This amulet, often made of green jasper, serpentine, or occasionally gold for the extremely wealthy, is shaped like the sacred scarab beetle, Khepri, which symbolized rebirth and the rising sun. It is one of the most important amulets placed directly on the mummy. You're instructed by the priest to place this amulet directly over the chest, often threading a thin linen band through a loop on its back to secure it against the area where the heart lies, internally. The scarab's purpose is twofold. First, to act as a replacement heart, in case the original heart was damaged or removed, and second, and more importantly, to ensure the heart doesn't betray its owner during the judgment. Inscribed on the flat underside of the scarab is a crucial spell, Chapter 30b of the Book of the Dead, which you can just make out with your tired eyes. The inscription typically contains a plea to the heart. O my heart which I had from my mother, O my heart which I had upon earth, do not rise up as a witness against me, do not contradict me in the tribunal. The priest, observing from a respectful distance, performs a ritualistic reading of the spell. You carefully adjust the amulet, ensuring it lies flat and secure. The contrast is stark, the priest's pure, resonant voice chanting ancient words of power, while your hands, sticky and stained, are performing the physical manipulation. You allow yourself a small, private moment of gentle sarcasm, your first of the section. A great piece of jewellery to make sure the boss doesn't snitch on himself in the next life. If only we had one for our foreman. As you work, you consider a quirky tidbit about the scarab itself. The beetle was revered because the Egyptians observed it rolling a ball of dung across the ground, interpreting this as the insect pushing the sun across the sky. The beetle, hatching from the dung ball, symbolised spontaneous creation and rebirth. You, who frequently battle dung-rolling beetles in the workshop, find the analogy amusingly gross, but you keep your thoughts to yourself. Now that the heart is settled and protected, you need to deal with the vast empty space left by the removal of the other organs. The body must be stuffed to restore a lifelike form, as a shriveled corpse would be considered an unacceptable vessel for eternity. You use large temporary linen packets of fragrant materials, sawdust, dry lichen, chopped straw, and valuable aromatic resins and spices like frankincense and myrrh. You carefully pack the chest and abdomen, using your knowledge of human anatomy and aesthetics to give the merchant a respectable, rounded contour. You don't want him to look like a concave stick figure when he is finally wrapped. The internal incision, the one made by the scribe, must now be closed. You use a large needle and heavy linen thread to roughly stitch the opening shut. Once stitched, the wound is sealed with a metal or wax plate called the Eye of Horus, or wedjat, which is fixed over the stitches with molten resin. The Eye of Horus is a powerful symbol of protection and healing, magically reversing the damage done to the body. You carefully smooth the thick, warm resin over the plate, ensuring a perfect seal, the smell of the melting resin temporarily overpowering the stench of death and the perfume of the unguents. The work is precise, demanding a blend of surgical skill and ritual knowledge. You are, in effect, a restoration artist. The internal stuffing must be neither too firm nor too soft, and the seal must be absolute to prevent any ingress of air or spirits. You are aware that the family will carefully inspect the mummy's final appearance before the sarcophagus is closed. You take a break, your back aching from the detailed, bent-over work. You wipe your hands, now slick with resin and fragrant oils, on your apron. You and your partner are discussing the latest gossip about a priest who got caught substituting cheap sawdust for expensive lichen in a mummy's internal stuffing. You allow a second light joke. He tried to cheat the gods, but the gods know how to spot a bargain bin mummy. Historians still argue whether the practice of stuffing the body with precious materials was purely for aesthetic reasons, or if the ancient Egyptians believed that the internal aromatic substances had magical properties essential for the ka and ba to recognize the body. Given the expense involved, it's likely both aesthetics and ritual significance were equally important, reinforcing the social status of the deceased. As the sun begins to dip, you finish applying a thin, final coat of fragrant oil to the entire body, restoring a kind of waxy luster to the skin. The merchant now looks dignified, ready for the next stage of anointing and, most importantly, the 70 days of meticulous, suffocating wrapping. The heart is safe, the scarab is secured, and the gods, for now, seem appeased. You move into the next demanding phase of the 70-day process, the intensive anointing and unguent application. The merchant's body is now fully dried, stuffed and sealed with the vital scarab in place. It has the consistency of brittle aromatic leather, but it lacks the suppleness and divine fragrance required for the afterlife. This is where you, the wetu, become a reluctant perfumer, dealing with vast quantities of rancid animal fats and rare, expensive resins. Your task is to restore the skin's elasticity, prevent cracking during the wrapping, and infuse the body with a sweet-smelling protective layer that the gods will recognize as ritually pure. You stand before a row of ceramic jars and alabaster bowls, holding the materials that define the luxury of this elite mummification: thick, sticky unguents, molten resins, and mounds of ground spices. The base of most of these unguents is often animal fat, beef tallow, or sometimes even goose fat, which has been melted down and mixed with the precious extracts. Because you work in a hot climate and these fats are slow to solidify, the unguents are often slightly rancid, possessing a cloying, heavy smell that mixes horribly with the underlying sense of natron and dry death. You have to plunge your hands into this lukewarm, greasy mixture and begin the painstaking process of massaging it into every inch of the mummy's body. You start at the head, gently working the thick oil into the scalp, neck and face. The skin, having shrunk, is tight, and you worry about tearing it. You use small wooden spatulas and the tips of your fingers to push the oils deep into the folds of the ears, under the chin, and into the shriveled lips. This job is intimacy of the most unpleasant kind, forcing you to touch the deceased in a sustained personal way. The grease saturates your skin, and the powerful musky scent of the oils becomes a part of your own aura. You know with grim certainty that you will smell like a walking apothecary's shop for the rest of your life. The quality of these materials is often dictated by foreign trade. Mainstream historical fact: the finest and most expensive aromatic resin used, frankincense, and the highly prized oil of myrrh were often sourced from the land of Punt, likely the Horn of Africa. These materials were not just expensive, Their acquisition involved massive state-sponsored trade expeditions, showing the national importance of these funerary rituals. You understand, as you smear the thick gold-hued oil across the mummy's desiccated back, that you are handling the economic wealth of the entire kingdom. You move down the torso and limbs, applying coat after coat. The oil is thick, and the sheer physicality of rubbing it into the leather-hard skin is exhausting. The goal is to make the mummy pliable and resistant to moisture and insects. This oily, sticky layer is a powerful preservative, sealing the body against the air. You occasionally have to incorporate finely ground spices directly onto the body. You use cinnamon, cassia bark, and various powdered roots. You take a handful of the reddish-brown powder and rub it onto the mummy's limbs, mixing it with the wet unguent to form a thick protective paste. The pungent, sharp aroma of the spices tries to cut through the heavy fat smell, resulting in a confusing olfactory blend that you find nauseating. During a moment of respite, you reflect on the persistent stickiness. Everything you touch becomes greasy. The tools, the linen, the walls of the workshop. You try to clean your hands with a rough cloth, but the oils only smear. You mutter to your partner, making your first light joke for the section. "I think if I fell into the Nile right now, I'd just float all the way to the delta. I'm basically a walking candle." The priest visits and inspects your work. He focuses on the appearance, not the process. He wants the skin to have a rich, dark luster. If the mummy looks too pale or too shrunken, he criticizes you harshly. You have to maintain an illusion of vitality, which requires constant attention to detail, like pushing small pieces of linen under the fingernails to make them look less retracted, or adding a touch of ochre pigment to the lips to give them a lifelike colour. The pressure to perform is immense. You know that any spot you miss, any small crease where the oil doesn't penetrate, could become a point of failure decades or centuries later. You are preparing this body for an eternity you will likely never enjoy yourself. You find a slightly disturbing yet fascinating, quirky tidbit while working on the feet. The Egyptians, obsessed with ensuring the body was whole, sometimes had to repair damage that occurred during life, or even during the initial embalming. You notice that the merchant has a prosthetic big toe, fashioned from wood and leather, which had been wrapped onto his foot while alive. You now must carefully oil this artificial appendage, giving it the same sacred treatment as the real skin, reflecting the belief that the body must be complete, whatever its composition. The application of molten resin is the final sealing step. You carefully heat a block of expensive black resin, likely derived from cedar or a similar wood, until it's a thick, hot liquid. You then ladle this over the body, letting it flow and cool into a hard, protective shell. This is a critical barrier, the body's permanent armour against moisture and decay. The heat of the resin is dangerous, and you have to work quickly, spreading it with wooden paddles before it hardens, trying not to burn your already sticky resin-coated fingers. The room fills with the sharp, almost acrid smoke of the melting resin, which momentarily gives you a welcome break from the sickly sweet odour of the rancid oils. Your back aches from bending over, and your arms are constantly cramping. You take a moment to straighten up, catching a reflection of yourself in a polished bronze tool, a grimy, oil-smeared figure who looks utterly exhausted. You allow your second light joke of the section. "I think I've put so much oil on this man. He's slick enough to slide right into the afterlife on his own." Historians still argue whether the resins used in the final sealing stage were intended primarily for chemical preservation or for their powerful, almost magical properties that were believed to ward off evil spirits and demons during the final journey. Given the elaborate ritualistic context, it's highly probable that the Egyptians viewed the resin as a sacred protective layer, necessary both for physical and spiritual integrity. You wipe down your tools, but the oil and resin stick to everything. You look at the merchant, now gleaming darkly under his coat of unguents and resin. He is preserved, fragrant, and sealed. He has survived the natron and the microbes, only to fall prey to your sticky, unrelenting hands. The stage is set for the 30 days of meticulous wrapping, the final, monotonous marathon to the tomb. You finished the messy, aromatic stage of anointing. The wealthy merchant is now sealed in a dark, glossy coat of resin and unguents, ready for the final, most time-consuming phase of the mummification, the wrapping. This process will consume the final 30 days of the ritual 70-day cycle, transforming the preserved corpse into the meticulously packaged artifact that will secure his passage to the afterlife. You stand before an enormous pile of linen strips. This is not just any linen. For a client of this status, these are strips of fine, high-quality fabric, often taken from old, clean temple garments, or even the deceased's own expensive household textiles. The sheer quantity is staggering. You will use literally hundreds of meters of fabric, possibly over 400 square yards in total, cut into strips of varying widths and lengths. This endless supply must be prepared beforehand by lower-ranking, often female workers, and you're acutely aware of the vast economic investment represented by this mountain of cloth. The work is monotonous, hot, and demands intense, focused precision. You begin, not with the body itself, but with the individual digits, the fingers and toes. Each one must be wrapped separately, a painstaking task that feels agonizingly slow. You take the narrowest strips, dip them lightly into molten resin to act as a glue and sealant, and wind them around each digit, forming a perfect miniature covering. This is not just preservation, it's an artistic act, ensuring the mummy appears whole and intact. You are constantly battling the heat, which causes the resin to harden too quickly, making the cloth stiff and unworkable, or your own sweat, which makes the linen stick unpleasantly to your fingers. Once the digits are done, you move on to the hands and feet, then the arms and legs, and finally the main torso and head. The wrapping is not random. It follows specific sacred patterns. The strips must be applied in layer upon layer, crossing and recrossing in deliberate sequence, ensuring that no part of the body is left unsealed. You wrap the merchant's body like a continuous fragile sculpture, gently pressing the linen to conform to his contours. The layers are built up slowly, sometimes reaching up to 20 layers thick in certain areas for maximum protection. Mainstream historical fact: the linen itself was often not simply clean, it was frequently saturated with resins, gums, and aromatic compounds. The best preserved mummies, like those of the New Kingdom pharaohs, show evidence of incredibly complex chemical recipes applied to the linen to make it act as a final, chemical barrier against moisture and insects. This elaborate glue was often a costly mixture of animal glue, beeswax, and fragrant oils, making the wrapping a chemical process as much as a physical one. The entire process is accompanied by the high priest's continuous recitation of spells and prayers. Every limb, every joint, every major section of the body is associated with a specific incantation that protects that part and magically restores its function in the afterlife. The priest stands over you, his voice droning on with the repetitive, ancient words of power, while you perform the sweaty, tedious labour. You hear the words so often that they blur into a rhythmic background chant, a soundtrack to your misery. You're expected to know when to pause your winding so the priest can place a specific amulet, the subject of the next section, and then restart immediately. The monotony is immense. You are performing the same repetitive action, hour after hour, day after day. You try to keep your spirits up with a bit of dark humour. You muse to your fellow wettiu, your first light joke for the section. We should start charging by the yard. This man must have ordered enough linen for a dozen sun sails. I'm starting to think he just really liked bandages. The precision required is truly exhausting. If you wrap a limb too tightly, the fragile, desiccated tissues beneath could be crushed, ruining the appearance. If you wrap it too loosely, the outer layers will slip and unravel, exposing the body. You must maintain a steady, even pressure, creating a smooth, uniform cocoon. The temperature inside the workshop is brutal, and the heavy, sweet-smelling air, thick with evaporating resins and spices, makes breathing difficult. You're constantly wiping sweat from your brow, careful not to let a drop fall onto the precious linen. You find yourself developing a strange intimacy with the body, knowing every curve and every flaw. You are the last person who will ever see this man's actual body, and you are responsible for its eternal presentation. This is where a quirky tidbit comes into play. When the wrapping is completed, the outermost layers of linen are sometimes meticulously painted with a thin coat of bright red ochre dye, particularly over the face and exposed areas. This was meant to invoke the colour of life, the setting sun, and perhaps even the rich red soil of the Nile flood, symbolising regeneration. It was one last artistic flourish to ensure the deceased was symbolically ready for rebirth. Your focus on the linen is absolute, yet you're always worried about external factors. Historians still argue whether the linen strips used for the lower and less visible parts of the body were always of high quality. or if lesser, coarser materials were often substituted to save cost once the outer, visible layers were secured. Given the ancient Egyptian obsession with ensuring the appearance of perfection, you suspect that even if they cheated, they did so artfully, using the cheaper stuff only for deep internal padding, which you certainly don't dare do for this wealthy client. As the final layers are applied, the mummy begins to take its final dignified form. You spend extra time ensuring the face, now merely a suggestion beneath the linen, is well formed. The outermost layer of wrapping is often done with a single massive sheet of linen, often decorated with painted funerary symbols, or a representation of the deceased's face, an early version of a shroud. You manage a second light joke with a tired sigh. If I ever get to the field of reeds, I'm going to demand a desk job. No more rolling up dead people like papyrus scrolls. By the end of the 30-day period, the merchant is completely encased, a solid, resin-soaked bundle of linen and magic. He is no longer a corpse, but a Sar, a transfigured, perfected being ready for eternity. You step back, your arms and back screaming from the repetitive strain, looking at the finished product. It is a masterpiece of preservation, engineering, and ritual. Your job is nearly done, but the spiritual elements, the amulets and spells, must be secured beneath and on top of these final layers. The wrapping is well underway, but you are constantly stopping and starting. The linen layers are not a simple shell. They are a matrix designed to hold a carefully orchestrated collection of amulets and charms, each imbued with specific protective powers and positioned strategically across the merchant's body. Your job, the wet dubbed, is to know exactly where these must go, a responsibility that demands precision, ritual knowledge, and a constant fear of messing up the magic. You stand by as the high priest, the overseer of the mysteries dictates the process. He holds the sacred texts and knows the exact spell or prayer that corresponds to the placement of each object. You, however, are the one with the sticky, resin-coated hands who must physically tuck the charms into the folds of the newly applied bandages. This phase is where your mundane, physical labour intersects most intimately with the profound spiritual ambition of the Egyptian afterlife. The sheer quantity of amulets is impressive, a testament to your client's wealth and paranoia about the journey to the field of reeds. The goal is to provide magical armour, warding off the myriad demons, hostile spirits, and dangers that lurk in the Duat, the underworld. The amulets are made of various materials, semi-precious stones, gold, silver, bronze, glass, and faience, and their shape is their power. For instance, as you finish wrapping the hands, the priest hands you a small golden jed pillar charm. You must carefully tuck this into the linen wrap at the base of the spine. The jed, resembling a backbone, symbolises stability, endurance, and the backbone of Osiris, representing his resurrection. The priest chants a powerful prayer about strength and eternal continuity as you push the small, hard object into the soft layers of linen, ensuring it won't shift or dislodge. Next, you move to the neck and throat area. Here you are instructed to place the two fingers amulet, a small charm shaped like the index and middle fingers. A quirky tidbit of ancient magic is that this amulet was meant to magically assist the deceased in cutting a path through the earth, or to assist the embalmer during the final, real-world sealing of the tomb. You can't help but think how useful a real magical charm would be for your back, which is currently screaming from the continuous bending. You work your way down the merchant's body, placing dozens of these small charged objects. You place the Tayet knot, or Isis knot, a loop of fabric symbolising the blood of Isis and feminine protective power, near the upper chest. Near the feet you place the Ankh, the symbol of life itself, ensuring the deceased retains his vitality. Every position is specific. Heart, already done. The Scarab, chapter 30, B of the Book of the Dead. Throat, neck, the headrest amulet, ensuring the head remains magically raised and that the mummy can wake up in the next world. Torso, various plaques inscribed with protective spells, often related to the sons of Horus, to ensure the internal organs are safe, even though they're in jars. You have to be incredibly careful. If a spell is recited incorrectly, or if an amulet is placed in the wrong position, say, a protective charm for the stomach is placed near the legs, the entire magical efficacy of that section of the mummy could be negated. The priest would blame you, the low-ranking assistant, for the failure, and the family would be furious. You try to focus on the soft, repetitive pressure of the linen in your hands, ignoring the complexity of the magic you're enacting. "This is your first light joke for the section," mumbled to your assistant as you adjust a small black was scepter symbolizing power. If the afterlife is this dangerous, maybe the merchant should have invested in better bodyguards while he was alive, not just a bunch of fancy rocks now. Mainstream historical fact. The belief in the power of amulets was so strong that the standard collection of protective charms for a high-status mummy included at least 14 to 20 different types of amulets, each designed to address a specific threat in the underworld, ranging from demons who might steal the mummy's voice to the risk of being forced to eat one's own waste. The sheer scope of perceived dangers in the afterlife dictated the complexity of your wrapping work. As you place an amulet, the priest instructs you to recite a portion of the spell yourself, a quick, rote memorization in the sacred language that you barely understand but must perfectly reproduce. This ritual ensures that the wet you is not just a labourer but a participant in the sacred magic, binding you to the success of the process. You are sharing in the secret knowledge, a small concession to your years of apprenticeship. Historians still argue whether the complex arrangement of the amulets, sometimes numbering into the hundreds in royal mummies, was purely based on a fixed religious tradition, or if it evolved over time into a kind of escalating magical arms race, with families constantly trying to outdo one another in the sheer volume and cost of the protection provided to the deceased. Given the expense of the gold and semi-precious stones, you suspect the latter, another indication of the merchant's status. The final stage of the amulet placement involves securing the linen layers themselves. You dip the outer sections of the linen into a final thick coat of molten resin, creating an impenetrable shell. You use the warm, sticky material to fix the outer amulets in place. You carefully position a pectoral plate, a large golden plaque decorated with protective deities, across the merchant's chest, gluing it securely to the linen with the dark, fragrant resin. This final, hard coating provides physical protection against grave robbers, a constant worry that you will cover in a later section, and magical protection against the elements. You try to ignore the heat, the stickiness, and the monotonous drone of the priest's voice. Your concentration slips for a moment, and you accidentally smear a blob of resin onto the priest's immaculate white sandal. He glares at you, a look of pure aristocratic disgust, and you immediately prostrate yourself, muttering a fast, profuse apology. He accepts it with a sneer, and you return to the task, your heart pounding. This is your second light joke, though entirely internal. I've just added a new layer of protection to the priest's foot, a resin shell. I hope he considers it a sign of my respect for his eternal footwear. The process is exhausting, requiring continuous attention for weeks. You are a human assembly line, responsible for the perfect placement of a kingdom's worth of spiritual wealth. The sun sets, casting long, dusty shadows across the workshop floor. You finish the last of the planned amulets for the day, a small girdle of Isis charm, and carefully tuck it into the linen near the waist. The merchant is now a truly fortified vessel, ready to move into the final preparation phase before the grand procession to the tomb. The winding is nearly complete, the merchant's body a fortified cocoon of linen, resin, and countless amulets. Now comes a crucial final step in the magical insurance policy for his eternal life, the placement of the papyrus scrolls containing the most potent funerary literature, what we now call the Book of the Dead. Your role here is less about manual labour and more about facing the grim, spiritual fear that despite all your 70 days of effort, the magic might still fail. The Book of the Dead is not a single, fixed volume, but a collection of around 200 spells or chapters, rites of coming forth by day, designed to provide the deceased with the passwords, incantations and map needed to navigate the treacherous landscape of the Duat, or the underworld. The wealthy merchant has paid for a high-quality papyrus roll, beautifully written by a skilled scribe, sometimes even illuminated with vignettes, showing key scenes like the weighing of the heart. The priest hands you the delicate scroll. It is fragile, dry, and smells faintly of the glue used to bind the papyrus sheets. You're instructed to place it carefully inside the outer layers of the wrapping, often positioned near the hands or chest, where the deceased could magically grasp it in the afterlife. You must ensure it is positioned flawlessly, tucked securely beneath a fold of resin-soaked linen, because if it shifts or is damaged, the spells might be rendered ineffective. This is your life's work, reducing eternity to the careful placement of a piece of dried reed paper. As you handle the scroll, you can't help but feel a tremor of awe, mixed with skepticism. The words are absolute power, spells to grant breath, to ward off snake demons, to ensure the heart's honesty, and crucially, spells to transform the deceased into various powerful forms, like a falcon or a lotus flower. Your task is to ensure this physical object, this piece of magical technology, works flawlessly. You realise that despite the thousands of pounds of natron, the gallons of expensive oil, and the dozens of protective charms, the entire venture still hinges on the power of these written words. You allow your first light joke for the section to surface, a weary internal sigh. 70 days of hard work, and it all comes down to a really well-written cheat sheet for the gods. Mainstream historical fact. One of the most common and vital spells included in the Book of the Dead was Chapter 125, which contained the negative confession. This was not a confession of sins, but a list of approximately 42 denials of wrongdoing, such as, "I have not committed evil against mankind," or "I have not stolen the food of the gods." The deceased was meant to recite this before the divine tribunal, essentially claiming innocence and fitness for the field of reeds. The fear of failed magic is a constant cold dread for you. You have done your best with the preservation, but the rest is up to the unseen forces and the purity of the ritual. What if the scribe made an error in copying the spell? What if the ink was imperfect? What if the high priest mispronounced an incantation during the opening of the mouth ceremony, which is yet to come? All your physical effort, the gutting, the drying, the wrapping, could be negated by a small spiritual slip. You, the lowest-ranking labourer, will undoubtedly be the scapegoat if the family later reports disturbing dreams or signs of the deceased's unrest. You contemplate the nature of the duat. The funerary texts describe a world teeming with horrifying obstacles, lakes of fire, guardian demons with grotesque heads, and spiritual gatekeepers demanding cryptic passwords. It's a terrifying journey, and the papyrus you're wrapping is the only thing standing between the merchant's soul and eternal, agonizing destruction. You're applying a thin layer of molten pitch over the linen strips, just above where you placed the papyrus. The pitch is thick, dark, and smells heavily of wood tar. This final sealing provides physical protection for the entire bundle, making the mummy nearly waterproof and highly resistant to insects and mould. It also gives the mummy its final iconic black appearance, the colour associated with the black fertile earth of the Nile, symbolising regeneration. As the pitch cools and hardens, you consider a quirky tidbit about the afterlife. The spells also provided for servant figurines called shabti, or ushabtis. These small mummiform figures were placed in the tomb alongside the body. You had a brief side job carving some of the cheaper, less detailed ones. The text you just placed contains a spell, Chapter 6, that magically animates these figures, compelling them to perform manual labour in the afterlife whenever the deceased is called upon to work in the field of reeds. You find a moment of dark solidarity with the poor, inanimate worker figurines. They, like you, exist only to perform labour for the wealthy elite, even in eternity. Your back aches, and the fumes from the hot pitch are making your head spin. You allow your second light joke as you smooth the tar-like material. "If I ever die, just toss me straight into the Nile." I'm not signing up for another afterlife job market, especially not one run by a tiny clay man. Historians still argue whether the placement of the papyrus scroll inside the mummy wraps was a feature of all elite mummifications, or if it became more common in later periods, as evidenced by some mummies having the text placed loosely between the legs or beside the body in the coffin. The method you're using, integrating it directly into the wrap, shows the supreme importance placed on this magical text for your client. The mummy must literally wear his survival guide. You meticulously finish the sealing process. The merchant is now a complete cohesive package, a body preserved by chemistry, protected by amulets, and guided by sacred text. He's ready for his final display before the family and the procession to the tomb. You step back, the smell of burnt resin and spices clinging to your nostrils. You've done everything that human hands can do, and everything that human magic can provide. You only hope it is enough to withstand the scrutiny of the gods. The grand final stage of mummification is in sight. But your miserable life as a wettu is not just defined by gore and heat. It's also defined by the harsh realities of ancient Egyptian economics. The cost of this process for the wealthy merchant is staggering, and that burden trickles down, creating an environment of scarcity, theft, and anxiety over your own meagre wage and the constant demands of the state. The core of the problem lies in the materials. Everything you use, from the highest grade natron salt mined in the desert to the frankincense and myrrh imported from distant lands, is either a state monopoly or a massively expensive commodity. The embalming workshop is, in effect, a highly taxed enterprise run under the supervision of the temple or the state bureaucracy. You are acutely aware that your workshop operates on a tight margin. The high priest collects the fee from the family, which includes the cost of all materials, the services of the scribes and priests, and a small allocation for the labourers. Your wage is laughably small, often paid not in coinage, which is still rare, but in barley or grain rations, and even these are subject to arbitrary deductions. The pressure to cut costs, and the temptation to steal, are immense. You spend your days handling resins that are literally worth more than silver. You know a small lump of the highest quality cedar oil resin, if smuggled out, could buy you a good meal and a few days' respite from this work. This is where the risk of theft becomes a dark shadow in your daily life. You or your fellow WTW occasionally attempt to substitute a small amount of an expensive material, say, replacing a pinch of precious myrrh with cheaper, local aromatic sawdust, and pocket the difference. However, the consequences of getting caught are severe. The penalty for stealing temple or state property, especially materials used in a sacred rite, could be anything from a public flogging to forced labour in the deadly mines or quarries. The supply chain is meticulously tracked by the temple scribes. They weigh the materials when they come in, and they inspect the finished product when it goes out. They know exactly how much resin should be consumed in a first-class mummification like the merchants. You have to be incredibly artful in any attempt at substitution. You allow yourself a moment of cynical reflection, your first light joke for the section. It's hard to cheat the gods when the gods have an accountant with a clay tablet and very tiny handwriting. Beyond the materials, there is the ever-present shadow of the tax collector. Even the small rations of barley you receive as pay are subject to a grain tax, a portion of your food taken by the pharaoh's local representative. This system of taxation, which fuels the entire kingdom, from massive temple-building projects to the army, means you're constantly working just to stay at subsistence level. You're a low-ranking professional, but you're still a citizen, and the pharaoh demands his due. Mainstream historical fact. The Egyptian economy was largely based on a centralized system of redistribution, heavily relying on the taxation of agricultural produce, barley, wheat, and labour. Temple workshops, including embalming houses, operated within this system, meaning every valuable resource they used was effectively managed by state bureaucracy, making private enterprise difficult and theft highly dangerous. You look at the meticulously wrapped mummy, a solid bundle of wealth. This deceased merchant spent a small fortune for this preservation. That money flowed through the hands of the priest, the scribes, the weavers who made the linen, and the miners who dug the natron. The entire 70-day process is a massive economic transaction, disguised as a religious ritual. You're simply the cheapest and most expendable link in that chain. You realise that the constant need for expensive materials drove innovations and cost-cutting measures in mummification. Historians still argue whether the practice of injecting cedar oil into the abdominal cavity, instead of evisceration, for a cheaper second-tier mummification package, was introduced purely as a cost-saving measure to avoid the expensive, time-consuming work of organ removal and canopic jars, or if it was seen as a genuinely alternative ritual. Either way, the price of materials dictated the variety of death packages available. The financial risk is amplified by the fact that you often purchase small necessary items for the workshop yourself. Cheap tools, oil for the lamps, a new brush, and you are rarely fully reimbursed by the priest. This forces you into tiny, desperate forms of entrepreneurship. You might try to sell the waste products, the used natron, which can be useful as a cheap bleach, or the discarded linen scraps. This is a quirky tidbit of your job. The waste of the rich man's eternal life is your only chance at a small, untaxed side income. You try to distract yourself from the anxiety by focusing on your work, which is currently securing the final layers of linen with a fresh application of molten pitch. The scent is acrid, and you momentarily forget about your economic worries. You look at the thick black layer forming over the mummy and mutter your second light joke. He's got more layers of tax protection than I have on my whole body. Good luck, tax demons. The priest enters the workshop with the chief temple scribe, who is carrying a clay tablet and a stylus, ready to make the final inventory of materials used. Your heart always sinks when the scribe arrives. He has a cold, calculating eye and a complete lack of regard for the physical labour you just endured. He's here to ensure that the pharaoh's tax revenue, channeled through the temple, has not been compromised by inefficiency, or worse, by your sticky fingers. You have to maintain an expression of bland, tired innocence as the scribe examines the body, weighs the remaining resins, and makes his final tally, deciding how much your poverty will cost the state this month. Your only hope is that the beauty of the final wrap will distract him from the ledger. You stand in the shadows of the workshop watching the temple scribe finish his inventory, feeling the persistent itch of the lice and the constant ache in your lower back. Your body is a testament to the sheer physical brutality of your job, but your deepest source of regret isn't the gore. It's the deep-seated social stigma and the crippling reality of your apprenticeship debt. You are not merely an employee, you're an apprentice, Wetty W, serving a long, arduous term that may span many years, possibly a decade, under a master embalmer and the watchful eye of the temple priest. For much of this period, your labour is essentially unpaid, or compensated only with the barest minimum of rations and a filthy shared corner to sleep in near the drying pits. This system of servitude is framed as a necessary devotion to the craft and the gods, but you know it for what it is. A source of cheap, expendable labour for the state's most unpleasant, yet critical, industry. The apprentice's debt isn't necessarily a monetary loan, it's a debt of time and service. You owe your master and the temple your years of youth, your health, and your labour in exchange for the secret knowledge of preservation. If you try to leave before your term is up, you face severe penalties, including state-enforced servitude. You are essentially trapped in this smelly, thankless profession until the temple deems you fully proficient and, crucially, deems your debt to the craft repaid. This lack of control over your own future fuels a deep, quiet resentment. You're a skilled craftsman. Your knowledge of human anatomy, chemistry, though you call it magic, and ritual is complex. Yet you are treated as little better than a slave. The social stigma of your profession is a bitter pill you swallow daily. As someone who constantly handles the dead, you are considered ritually impure by much of society. You are the ultimate outsider. Merchants might refuse to sell you food from a clean basket. Religious festivals may bar your entry, and neighbours keep their distance, afraid that the taint of death will rub off on them. You are necessary for the nobles' eternal life, but you're too gross for their temporal company. You can never truly wash the smell off, and this odour, a permanent mix of natron, rancid oil and dry death, acts as a continuous invisible barrier between you and the rest of the world. You've noticed that people don't just move away from you in the street, they actively recoil. This stigma profoundly impacts one of the most fundamental aspects of a man's life in ancient Egypt: finding a wife. You struggle immensely to establish a normal family life. Women from respectable, non-embalming families won't consider marrying into your profession. You are generally forced to marry a woman from another low-caste trade, or often you marry within the small community of embalmer families, further cementing your isolation. This is a quirky tidbit of your life. Your job ensures the lineage of the wealthy, but makes your own lineage difficult to establish. You manage a cynical smile, your first light joke for this section, aimed at your junior apprentice as he tries to discreetly scratch a massive insect bite on his arm. The priest says we prepare the body for the most beautiful bride, eternity, but can't find a wife for a fellow who smells like a bouquet of myrrh and death. You look at the sealed mummy of the merchant. He, through the virtue of his wealth and your sweat, will enjoy the perfect family life in the afterlife. You, the architect of his eternity, will spend your life struggling for a few extra barley rations and dodging the judgmental glances of the baker's wife. Mainstream historical fact. The scribal class, in contrast to the manual labourers, wrote texts admonishing children to learn to write and avoid the filthy trades, like metalworking, weaving, or certainly the embalmer's craft, which confirmed the low social standing and lack of intellectual prestige associated with manual labour, regardless of its importance. This societal contempt was deeply ingrained. Your master, the actual embalmer, is only slightly better off. He is skilled and may be reimbursed fairly, but he still carries the professional stigma. He constantly pressures you, reminding you of the debt of your apprenticeship, not because he is purely cruel, but because he is trapped in the system too, needing to maintain his own status and production quotas for the temple. You pick up a piece of the final wrappings, the sticky linen, and continue to apply the final pitch seal to the mummy's head. You realise the absurdity. You are preparing this man to become a divine being, a sah, while you yourself are considered less than dirt. Historians still argue whether the exclusion of embalmers from temples and religious ceremonies was a universal rule throughout Egyptian history, or if it varied by period and region. Some evidence suggests that the most senior, ritually pure priests involved in the final rites were given special dispensations. But for you, the lowest labourer, the segregation is absolute and keenly felt. You think about the years you've spent here, the disgusting things you've had to do, the diseases you've survived. You make your second light joke, a wry whisper to the merchant's motionless form. Well, friend, I hope the next life is worth it, because you're costing me this one. The only solace is the bond with your fellow WETIRW. They are the only people who understand the heat, the stench, and the social isolation. You share food, you share gossip, and you share the grim humour that keeps you from going mad. You're an outcast, but you're not alone. You have the secret knowledge, and one day, when your debt is paid, you might become a master yourself, a master of a despised but indispensable craft. You have survived the social isolation and the long debt of your apprenticeship, and now, as you apply the finishing touches of pitch to the merchant's linen wrappings, your mind drifts to the wider, often bizarre world of ancient Egyptian medicine and hygiene, a world where your gross profession seems almost normal. Your proximity to disease and death gives you a unique, if repulsive, insight into the strange recipes and treatments your civilization accepts as standard. Life in ancient Egypt is fundamentally unsanitary, and your embalming workshop is the epicenter of biological risk. You're a repository of practical, if unscientific, medical knowledge, simply by virtue of handling decaying matter and toxic substances for years. You know, for instance, that infections are best treated by keeping them dry, and you've seen enough failed magical cures to trust your own crude methods of applying heat and pressure more than the village healer's incantations. You're constantly reminded of the general filth in other aspects of life. One of the most infamous, and frankly disgusting, items you encounter in your side reading of medical texts is the use of crocodile dung as a form of contraception. You've had to source some for a particularly desperate client of your neighbour, the midwife. The logic, you understand, is that the dried dung, when mixed with sour milk and placed against the female anatomy, forms a kind of barrier. The idea of placing dried excrement, from a dangerous reptile no less, inside the body is repulsive, yet it's a quirky tidbit of your era's medical practice, and a reminder that your embalming fluids aren't the only disgusting things being handled professionally. You manage a shudder and your first light joke for the section, "We may deal with death, but at least we're not putting reptile waste where it doesn't belong." The contrasting use of honey highlights the strange mix of efficacy and superstition in Egyptian medicine. Honey, a naturally occurring antiseptic, is used widely for treating wounds. You use it yourself for small cuts, as you've observed that it significantly reduces the likelihood of infection. The honey is sweet, clean, and one of the few pleasant scents that enters your malodorous world. It is a genuine mainstream historical fact that the ancient Egyptians were masters of treating wounds and broken bones, with the Edwin Smith papyrus detailing over 48 surgical cases, demonstrating a sophisticated empirical understanding of trauma care, far removed from the magic spells. However, even the practical application of honey is often mixed with the bizarre. You once saw a man treated for a persistent cough with a mixture of herbs, honey, and rat feces. The rationale was likely rooted in sympathetic magic, but the obvious health risks of introducing rodent waste into the body seem to be entirely missed. You constantly think about your own hygiene, or lack thereof. The lack of proper soap, the heavy use of animal fats that are difficult to wash off, and the continuous exposure to dust and disease mean you're always fighting a losing battle. You rely heavily on scraping your skin with an strigil, a curved metal tool, to remove the layers of oil, sweat, and dirt before you plunge into the Nile. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptian dental health, often depicted as poor with widespread decay and abscesses, was primarily due to the abrasive grit from millstones that got into their bread, or due to a combination of that abrasive diet and a high intake of sugars, primarily from honey and dates. The consensus leans towards the grit, which is why you see so many fellow Wet'ye who have lost their teeth young, having eaten so much sand and abrasive materials in their lifetime. You often hear a friend complain about his grinding teeth, a permanent souvenir of the desert life. You reflect on the strange recipes for the living that you sometimes hear about, which only emphasize the poor sanitation of the age. People use mixtures of spices and animal fat as deodorant, which often just blends two smells into a new, complex stink. You've even heard of eye paints made with galena, lead ore, that while providing protection from the sun's glare, carried the risk of lead poisoning, a quirky tidbit of dangerous beauty standards. You are dealing with death, but at least your profession's materials are intended to preserve, not harm, the body. The priest, your supervisor, occasionally brings in medical scrolls for you to study, particularly those concerning aromatic resins and their properties. He is an educated man, and his understanding of the materials goes beyond simple ritual. This is where you learn that the cedar oil you use is a powerful insecticide, and that the myrrh helps prevent tissue hardening. Your work, therefore, is grounded in a rough and ready knowledge of chemistry, even if the priest frames it in the language of gods and spells. You're standing over the merchant's mummy, applying one last protective layer of a beeswax mixture to the head wrappings. The scent is a clean, earthy wax smell, momentarily masking the powerful resin odour. You manage your second light joke. I've wrapped this man so tightly and oiled him so completely he could probably pass for a giant candle. No crocodile dung, though, thank the gods. The sheer audacity of the living to use such repulsive treatments makes your life less isolated. You realise that while your work is richly impure, the daily lives of the pure are often medically disgusting. The lines are blurred, the embalming house and the average dwelling are not as far apart in terms of sanitation as the priest would have you believe. You're simply dealing with a more concentrated, expensive form of organic waste. You secure the final knot of the linen, tying it neatly across the chest. The merchant is ready. Your anxieties now pivot from the physical degradation of the body to its spiritual and physical security in the tomb. The wealthy merchant's mummy is sealed, wrapped, and ready. You have performed your duty to the letter, transforming a mortal body into an eternal vessel. But your anxiety doesn't end here. It merely shifts from the threat of microbial decay to the very real and persistent threat of tomb raiders. The security of the deceased's eternal rest is now largely out of your hands, and this vulnerability is a source of bitter professional regret. You know that the moment the grand funeral procession leaves the city, heading toward the necropolis on the western bank of the Nile, the mummy is instantly valuable. Not because of its spiritual significance, but because of the vast wealth entombed with it. The gold jewellery, the fine furniture, the foodstuffs, and most importantly to your craft, the expensive materials used in the mummification itself. The gold of the mask, the alabaster of the canopic jars, the sheer quantity of precious resins like frankincense, all of it is a powerful lure to the desperate and the greedy. Your low social status means you often hear whispers and rumours that never reach the ears of the high priest. You know that tomb robbery is a rampant, almost professional crime in Egypt. Whole gangs operate in the necropolis, sometimes bribing the very guards meant to protect the tombs. You've heard the grim stories of newly sealed tombs being violated within weeks, the mummies unwrapped and desecrated for the smallest amulet or the cheapest piece of linen. The knowledge that your 70 days of grueling, ritually pure labour could be undone in a single night by a crude, opportunistic thief is profoundly disheartening. You spent weeks meticulously tucking tiny amulets into the linen wraps, only for a robber to tear through them in minutes, looking for gold. You applied the expensive resins to seal the body, and the robber will simply hack through that with a bronze axe. The merchant's family has, of course, paid for elaborate tomb defences, false walls, deep shafts, and heavy stone sarcophagi. But you know these are merely physical barriers, and every barrier has a weak point that the robbers, who are often former tomb builders, already know. This is why the fear of the mummy's curse is so prevalent. The curse is inscribed on the tomb walls, warnings of divine wrath, blindness, disease, and the destruction of the robber's lineage are not just for show. They are the final magical defence against the inevitable violation. You, the Wet'ye W, rely on these inscriptions to succeed where your physical handiwork fails. You find a dark humour in the situation. Your first light joke for the section: We spent all that time trying to save his soul, but the best protection we gave him was a strongly worded letter on the wall. Mainstream historical fact. The discovery of papyri detailing court records from the New Kingdom proves that tomb robbery was a serious and officially recognised problem. These documents show that investigators interviewed thieves, traced stolen goods, and administered harsh punishments, confirming that the curse was often a necessary legal and spiritual deterrent against very real human greed. You consider the spiritual repercussions. The ancient Egyptians believed that the body must remain intact for the ka, life force, and the ba, soul, to reunite and achieve the afterlife. A defiled or destroyed mummy means a spiritual second death, consigning the deceased to eternal non-existence. The mummy's curse is the magical mechanism for inflicting this same fate, spiritual damnation and a failed afterlife, on the person who perpetrated the violation. The threat of spiritual non-existence is often a greater deterrent than the threat of a guard's sword. You're now in the final moments of preparation, securing the mummy into its first coffin. You are aware that the resin-soaked linen you applied provides a small physical defence. It's incredibly tough to cut through, and the resins are bitter and unpleasant. But it's not foolproof. The only perfect defence would be perfect secrecy, which never exists. You're particularly worried about the canopic jars. You and your assistant packed the merchant's lungs, liver, stomach and intestines into those beautiful alabaster vessels, which will be placed in a separate chest in the tomb. The jars themselves, especially the finely carved lids of the Sons of Horus, are prime targets for robbers who care nothing for the desecration of the deceased's viscera. Historians still argue whether the legends and stories of the mummy's curse were primarily created and spread by the ancient Egyptian priesthood to protect their profitable domain and the sanctity of the royal tombs, or if they genuinely reflected deeply held public fear of spiritual reprisal. Given the economic value of the tombs, the priests certainly had a strong financial motive to promote such a powerful deterrent. You adjust the funerary mask that will be placed over the mummy's head and shoulders, a beautiful, stylized portrait, often made of gilded cartonnage, or, for the super-wealthy, beaten gold. This mask ensures the ka and ba can recognise the body, but it is also the greatest single lure for a robber. The moment this mask is placed on the mummy and the coffin lid is sealed, your work is complete, and the risk officially transfers to the next world. A quirky tidbit that often makes you shake your head is that one of the common methods of tomb robbery involved the thieves actually using the sophisticated funerary passages and ventilation shafts to enter the tomb, often aided by the very plans drawn up by the builders. Your civilization is so organised that even its criminals are highly specialised. You pause, looking at the beautifully wrapped mummy one last time. You whisper your final light joke for the section, a tired plea. Please, for the love of Osiris, just make it to the field of reeds without getting unwrapped. 70 days of my life are riding on you. You close the first coffin lid, the thud echoing in the chamber. You can only pray the magic of the curses holds up against the hunger of your fellow man. The physical preservation and magical fortification of the wealthy merchant's mummy are complete, the body now sealed within its first inner coffin. You have endured the heat, the stench, and the spiritual anxiety. However, your period of professional torment is not yet over, for now you must face the final terrifying tribunal, the scrutiny of the deceased's family. This is the ultimate test of quality control, and a poor result can mean not just your meagre pay withheld, but a reputation ruined, and possibly a punishment beating. The family, often led by the eldest son or the chief widow, is here for a final inspection before the mummy is transferred to the heavy stone sarcophagus and sealed away forever. They have paid an immense sum, a small fortune equivalent to several small estates, for the 70-day service, and they expect absolute perfection in both the preservation and the aesthetic presentation. This is the moment when the priest and the temple's reputation are on the line, and by extension, your competence. You stand stiffly near the coffin, sweating through your linen apron, while the high priest glides in with the family. The air is thick with tension and the heavy perfume of the family's expensive unguents, which contrasts sharply with your own workaday stench of pitch and myrrh. The family circles the inner coffin, their eyes sharp and critical. They are not merely looking at a preserved corpse, they are assessing the quality of their massive investment in their ancestors' eternal life. Their primary focus is on the aesthetics and the likeness. They want the mummy to look dignified, recognisable, and intact. They inspect the wrapping, looking for any slips, wrinkles, or areas where the bandages might be uneven or too loose. They examine the resin coating, ensuring the surface is smooth, dark, and glossy, not patchy or cracked. You hold your breath as the eldest son leans close to inspect the face, which is covered by a beautifully painted cartonnage mask. You spent hours ensuring the shape of the head underneath the wraps was perfect to support that mask, and praying the drying process hadn't caused any unsightly facial collapse. You feel a surge of intense, silent professional pride as the son nods slightly. Your meticulous stuffing of the body cavities, restoring the merchant's figure to a lifelike plumpness, has paid off. A mummy that was too shrunken or skeletal would be deemed a failure, a sign that the natron treatment was insufficient, or that you were lazy in the stuffing phase. The pressure of producing a flawless result for the elite is enormous. Failure to meet these high standards could lead the family to petition the temple authorities for a partial refund, which would instantly result in the temple exacting the lost funds from the entire embalming crew, starting with the low-ranking Wet W. The risk of punishment is very real. If the family were to find evidence of visible damage, like a torn patch of skin or, worse, a sign of insect infestation from your poor hygiene, you could face severe physical reprimand from the priest himself. You try to distract yourself with a cynical thought, your first light joke for this section. They've paid enough to have him look like he just took a short nap, not like he spent 40 days buried in salt. I should be charging extra for lifelike contouring. The priest naturally takes all the credit for the perfect presentation, speaking eloquently about the divine rites and the purity of the process. He never mentions your name, or the endless sticky hours you spent elbow deep in the merchant's interior, but you know that your silent labour is what truly produced this beautiful result. Mainstream historical fact: the high cost of mummification ensured that the process became a competitive business, especially during the New Kingdom. Families often had detailed contracts with the embalmers, specifying the quality of the materials, the type of resin, the quantity of spices, and the amount of gold for the mask, which explicitly mandated a high degree of quality control and accountability for the results. The family then inspects the canopic jar chest, which you are preparing to place alongside the coffin. They examine the alabaster jars and the finely carved lids of the Sons of Horus. They want to ensure the quality of the stone is high and that the inscriptions are accurate. If the lids were chipped or the carving was crude, it would suggest disrespect for the vital organs inside, leading to immediate complaint. You are confident here. You made sure the apprentice meticulously polished those lids for 2 full days. You contemplate a quirky tidbit about this scrutiny. Sometimes, wealthy families commissioned a reserve head, a plaster or limestone sculpture of the deceased's head, to be placed in the tomb. This was a backup plan, an extra layer of magical protection in case the mummy was utterly destroyed. It was a sign of extreme caution and a subtle lack of faith in the permanence of the mummification itself. But it was also a direct comment on the risk of your work failing. The family's inspection of the ritual purity is paramount. They look for any sign of bloodstains on the wrappings, an obvious sign of sloppiness, or misplaced amulets. The priest directs their attention to the strategically placed pectoral plate and the visible scarab on the chest, explaining their magical function. You know the placement is correct, having followed the ritual text precisely, but you still worry that a fold of linen might slip at the wrong moment. Historians still argue whether the extreme variation in the quality of non-royal mummies found across different periods was due primarily to differing family wealth, or if it reflected varying standards and skill levels among the different private embalming workshops, highlighting the commercial and competitive nature of the business. You believe it's a bit of both, but mostly wealth. You can only make a masterpiece if you're given gold to work with, not just cheap sawdust. Finally, after what feels like an hour of agonizing silence and intense staring, the eldest son steps back and gives a decisive, if emotionless, nod to the priest. The inspection is over. The merchant's eternal rest is approved. The priest sends you a small, curt gesture of dismissal. Your reward for a job well done is not praise, but simply being allowed to leave without a beating. You wipe your greasy, aching hands on your apron and feel a momentary exhausted sense of relief. You managed your second light joke as you leave, a quiet murmur to your assistant. Well, we passed the family's test. Now we just have the actual gods to worry about. Easy day, the relief is short-lived. You must now prepare for the next grim task, helping transport the final heavy sarcophagus to the tomb site. and then, immediately, moving on to the next client, which is already waiting, a vast smelly pile of smaller, less dignified animal bodies. You've earned a brief, fleeting moment of relief having satisfied the wealthy merchant's family. Now, before you can even properly clean the pitch and resin from your tools, the unpleasant reality of your side hustle comes crashing down. The mass production of animal mummies. This is the low-paid, exhausting grind that fills the gaps in your schedule, adds significant physical burden to your workload, and reveals the sheer scale of the Egyptian death industry. Your workshop isn't solely dedicated to the elite of society. A significant portion of the temple's income, and thus a core part of your miserable job, comes from the staggering demand for animal offerings. These are not pets mummified for bereaved owners. These are votive offerings, millions of animals mummified and entombed as sacred gifts to the gods. Pilgrims and petitioners from all across Egypt would pay for a ready-made mummy to dedicate to the god associated with that animal. An ibis for Thoth, a falcon for Horus, a cat for Bastet, a crocodile for Sobek, and so on. You're now shifted to the animal processing area, which is less a surgical theatre and more a factory floor. The speed and scale are brutal. Instead of the meticulous 70-day high-resin treatment for the merchant, these animals receive a cheap, rapid, and mass-produced process. The priority is volume and speed, not preservation quality. The methods are crude. For small creatures like birds and kittens, evisceration is often skipped entirely. They are simply plunged into vats of hot bitumen or heated resin, a cheap, fast way to seal and preserve the tissues, or buried quickly in natron for a far shorter period than a human. The larger animals, like baboons or crocodiles, require a rushed evisceration, which is performed quickly and sloppily. The smell in this area is horrific, a rank mix of countless decomposing small animals, cheap tar, and low-grade natron. The contrast with the perfumed high-status human work is sickening. This is your side hustle grind. It's physically exhausting because you are handling huge numbers of bodies, often in batches. You might spend a day scraping and wrapping dozens of mummified falcons, your hands aching from the repetitive small movements. The pay is abysmal, a meagre commission that barely justifies the effort, but it's work the temple demands. Your third light joke for the section escapes your lips as you quickly dip a dried cat into a bucket of sticky pitch. This cat is already getting a faster ticket to the afterlife than I ever will. Probably smells better too. Mainstream historical fact. Archaeological excavations have uncovered staggering numbers of these animal mummies, millions upon millions. For example, catacombs at Saqqara contained hundreds of thousands of mummies dedicated to the ibis god Thoth and the cat goddess Bastet, proving the sheer scale of the mass production that defined this part of your job. The sheer logistics of acquiring, raising and mummifying animals on this scale required a vast, complex infrastructure entirely reliant on low-wage labour like yours. The wrapping for these animals is rushed. You use cheap, coarse linen wrapped hastily, often without the meticulous placement of amulets or the use of expensive oils. The wrappings frequently conceal a gruesome reality. Sometimes the bundles don't even contain the whole animal, or they might contain multiple fragments to speed up the process. A quirky tidbit that you know all too well is that the high demand sometimes led to outright fraud. Some bundles sold as ibis mummies to unsuspecting pilgrims were later found by archaeologists to contain only mud, sticks, or fragments of unrelated bird skeletons, an early example of consumer deception in the spiritual economy. You are constantly battling the heat and the fly problem, which is exponentially worse here. The animal remains attract swarms of insects, and you have to work at a frantic pace to get them processed and wrapped before they become hopelessly maggot-ridden. Your workshop is perpetually buzzing, a low, maddening sound that haunts your dreams. You think about the spiritual context. These offerings are seen as a form of communication with the gods, a solidified prayer. The pilgrim pays you a small amount, you provide the preserved vessel, and the gods, hopefully, look favourably on the donor. You're simply the grubby mechanic translating faith into a tangible, if smelly, object. Historians still argue whether the proliferation of these animal cults and the massive demand for votive mummies was a sign of religious fervour and access for the common people, or if it represented a commercialisation and decline in the deeper spiritual meaning of Egyptian religion, turning ritual into an industrialised commodity. You lean toward the latter. It's a grind that pays the priest well and keeps you exhausted. You wipe your sticky hands on your apron, looking at the growing mountain of animal mummies ready for transport. They are all destined for mass burial in vast catacombs, a far less dignified end than the merchant's elaborate single tomb, but they represent your continuing thankless employment. You sigh, grab another dead falcon, and start the quick perfunctory wrapping process, using the roughest linen. This job may be low status and low pay, but it is necessary. You're a crucial cog in the vast roaring machine of the Egyptian death industry. You manage one last, tired light joke. We're the only people in Egypt who get paid less for preserving animals than they charge for a single loaf of bread. Having finished the mass production of animal mummies, you finally turn your attention to a brief but necessary period of cleaning, both of the workspace and fleetingly of yourself. This brings you into direct and dangerous contact with the lifeblood of Egypt, the Nile River, which is also the largest source of filth and disease you face. An ironic and grim reality for a civilization so obsessed with purity. Your embalming house, the Ibu, is strategically located near the western bank of the Nile, but always set slightly apart from the main populace. This proximity is essential. Mummification requires a vast amount of water. You need it for rinsing the body cavity, for washing the natron residue off the desiccated corpse, for mixing some of the less expensive resins, and for the constant necessary cleaning of your tools and the workshop itself. And of course, you need it for drinking, bathing, and preparing your meagre meals. This water, however, is your greatest health threat. The Nile is the sewer of Egypt. The river that gives life is also the river that carries the waste of every city, village, and person upstream. You know that every kind of filth is discharged directly into the river. Household refuse, human and animal excrement, the runoff from every dirty industry, and the residue from other embalming houses. When you draw water from the river, even for cleaning, you're drawing a murky biological soup. You, the Wetyu, are constantly battling waterborne diseases. You're intimately familiar with the symptoms of various parasitic and bacterial infections. Bilharzia, schistosomiasis, caused by parasites that thrive in the Nile's slow-moving waters and enter the skin, is a crippling reality for every Egyptian, but particularly for those who constantly handle the water, like you. You often suffer from persistent bloody urine and chronic fatigue, symptoms you grimly accept as the cost of living by the river. Mainstream historical fact. Diseases carried by the Nile were so prevalent that evidence of schistosomiasis, Bilharzia, has been found in the remains of mummies dating back thousands of years. Other common infectious diseases spread through contaminated water included various forms of dysentery and typhoid fever, which constantly swept through the populace, keeping you, the embalmer, in continuous business. When you must bathe or clean your tools, you try to draw the water quickly, avoiding the sluggish edges and praying you don't step on a snail that harbours the deadly parasite. You have seen colleagues incapacitated or killed by severe fevers caused by drinking the contaminated water. The irony is that you spend your life preventing the decay of a single wealthy body, while the most basic necessity for your own survival, the water you drink, is slowly killing you. You are currently attempting to scrub the thick black pitch and dried blood from a set of bronze hooks and spatulas. The grime is stubborn, and you have to use a mix of sand and water rubbing furiously. The water runs black, and you have to empty your bucket back into a designated pit, hoping it doesn't immediately flow back into the main river channel near your drawing spot. The priest, of course, has a system for ritual purification. He uses filtered or boiled water for the sacred rites, and his food and water are kept scrupulously clean. You, the labourer, are relegated to the common, polluted source. This contrast is your first light joke for the section, a muttered complaint as you scrub. The gods get the pristine water for their prayers, and we get the soup of every person who lived upstream. I'm starting to think the Nile is the only thing in Egypt that's never been purified. You know that the climate exacerbates the water problem. The intense heat accelerates the proliferation of bacteria in the sluggish water, making the Nile a greater risk during the low water season before the annual inundation. The sheer difficulty of keeping anything clean is immense. Your low wages also prevent you from affording the protective measures used by the elite. You can't afford a full-time servant to boil and filter your drinking water, nor can you afford to live far from the river and pay for water to be hauled in. You are trapped by your poverty in the most biologically dangerous area of Egyptian society. You observe a quirky tidbit about the temple's waste management. The remains of the eviscerated organs and other biological waste from the human mummification are often treated with special care. sometimes ritually buried in the sand or even mixed with the offal fed to sacred animals, to ensure they don't pollute the river and compromise the ritual purity. However, the waste from the hundreds of animal mummies you processed is often simply dumped in a common pit, where the toxic mixture of cheap resin, animal fat and biological residue is left to leach directly back into the ground, and eventually the river. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptians had a conceptual understanding of microscopic germs causing disease, or if their sanitary practices, like shaving their heads, avoiding the dead, and using alcohol, palm wine, as a preservative, were based purely on empirical observation of what seemed to reduce sickness and decay. While their practices often had the effect of reducing bacterial load, the true understanding of contagion was likely absent, which explains the continued prevalence of waterborne illness despite their ritualistic cleanliness. You take a long, deep breath, trying to clear the dusty, hot air from your lungs. The only thing you look forward to is the moment the sun dips low enough for you to stop scrubbing and collapse onto your reed mat. You make your second light joke, a grim reflection on the health risks. I've handled enough death to know that the greatest demon in the underworld isn't the lion-headed one. It's the parasite swimming in the Nile. The constant awareness of contamination informs your every move. You never put your hands near your mouth. You use a fresh cloth for your face every day, a luxury you steal from the mummy supply, and you try to drink as little water as possible, even though the heat demands otherwise. The Nile is your master, your provider, and your greatest threat. You finish cleaning the tools, the sticky residue finally gone, and look out toward the vast brown river flowing silently in the distance. It is time to prepare for the final, quiet reflection on your own mortal coil. You've supervised the merchant's final journey to his elaborate stone tomb. The procession is over, the sarcophagus is sealed, and the curses are carved deep into the stone. The high priest has collected his final fee and departed, smelling of expensive oils and piety. You're left alone in the quiet, dusty expanse of the necropolis, covered in the grim residue of 70 days of labour. Your journey as a single-speaker, bedtime history scriptwriter, walking in the sweaty sandals of the Wetu, is drawing to a close. You finally have a moment to contemplate your own fleeting existence, contrasting the grand promise of eternity you built for the wealthy with the grim reality of your own mortal coil. You have spent your life preparing others for glory, yet your own end will be humble, undignified, and utterly devoid of the costly rituals you mastered. You're acutely aware that your body, ravaged by constant exposure to disease, toxic resins, and the harsh desert sun, is unlikely to last into a comfortable old age. Your profession is physically demanding and biologically dangerous. Unlike the merchant, you have no vast stores of grain, no herds of cattle, and no meticulously prepared tomb waiting for you. When your time comes, you will receive the poor man's mummification, if you receive one at all. You won't get the full 70-day treatment. There will be no careful evisceration, no precious canopic jars, and certainly no gold-plated scarab over your heart. Your body will likely be treated with a simple, quick preservation method, perhaps a short dunk in a cheap bitumen solution, or maybe just dried quickly in the hot desert sand, wrapped in the roughest, coarsest linen scraps you couldn't use on a dog. The entire process might take 7 days, not 70. Your family, which is likely small and poor, will not be able to afford the Book of the Dead to guide you. Your afterlife hope rests on a cheap, small wooden shabti figure, a servant you probably carved yourself on a slow afternoon, and the basic assumption that the gods, who are generally preoccupied with pharaohs and rich merchants, might overlook your humble origins and let you pass the final judgment. You look at your hands, still faintly sticky with the remains of the merchant's final pitch seal. You have first-hand knowledge of the magic and the ritual, yet you know that the true prerequisite for eternal life is wealth, not ritual purity or skill. This is the ultimate quiet bitterness of your profession. Mainstream historical fact: the overwhelming majority of the Egyptian population, the farmers, labourers and craftsmen like you, were interred in simple graves in the desert. While their bodies often naturally desiccated due to the heat and dryness, they lacked the ritual preparation and accompanying grave goods necessary to guarantee the magical rebirth, say, reserved for the elite. Despite this grim certainty, you hold on to a fragment of hope. Your meagre hope is rooted in the very magic you enact. You know the words, you know the process, and you believe that perhaps, Because you dedicated your life to the sacred task, the great god Osiris might look kindly upon your professional service. You are the one who ensured that the wealthy could face the tribunal of Maat. Surely that counts for something. You manage a final, tired light joke as you pick up your tools, the third of the section and the last of the entire script. Well, I guess if I don't make it to the field of reeds, at least I'll know why. I'll probably be too busy polishing the coffins of the men who paid me. You begin the long, lonely walk back toward the meagre shelter you call home. You walk away from the imposing grandeur of the new tomb and the promise of eternity it holds. You're walking toward the polluted Nile, the inevitable fevers, and the constant struggle for barley, a quirky tidbit that sustains a fleeting moment of your hope. You recall the tales that the god of the dead, Anubis, the jackal-headed deity, was himself the patron of the embalmers. You cling to the hope that your patron god, the one who oversaw the very first mummification of Osiris, might put in a good word for you when you finally reach the Hall of Two Truths. Historians still argue whether the Egyptian funerary religion, with its emphasis on wealth and costly preparation, offered a genuinely accessible path to the afterlife for the common population, or if the expensive rituals created a religious divide, ensuring only the elite had a guaranteed chance at true eternal life. For you, the answer is sadly obvious. The cost of a perfect afterlife is simply too high. You reach the edge of the necropolis, the last rays of the sun fading into the dust. You carry your tools, your only true wealth, and the secret knowledge of how to cheat death. You look back one last time at the towering tombs, monuments to other men's wealth, and then you turn your focus inward. You've prepared the elite for an eternity of leisure. All you can do now is prepare yourself for a night of troubled sleep and the hope of simply waking up tomorrow. The sun has finally disappeared behind the Libyan plateau, pulling the last vestiges of heat from the desert and wrapping the Nile Valley in a soft, cooling blanket of night. The buzzing of the flies has finally ceased, replaced by the gentle hush of the night air. Let the deep quiet settle in now. The long journey through the embalmer's workshop is complete. You can let the sticky resins, the pungent spices, and the heavy scent of natron fade away from your imagination. You're safe now, far from the heat, the pollution, and the ceaseless labour of the wetty W. That ancient world, with its strange mix of sacred beauty and brutal reality, is receding into the past. As the darkness deepens, let the weariness of the millennia-old worker sink down into the soft comfort of your own bed. The merchant is sealed in stone, the embalmer has walked home, their fate is written. Your night is your own. Drift now and know that you are finally clean, you're whole, and you're safe. Close your eyes, let the silence be your guide, and let the gentle current of sleep carry you away.